everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Sabi. I'm the program manager here at the library. And it is National Coffee Day today. So I'm sure you are all coffee drinkers. Well, we have Jake Maladra he's a store manager at the Starbucks in South Elgin on Randall Road, and he has generously offered to come do this presentation for us today. He's going to talk about different blends of coffee from various origins, areas around the world, and increase our knowledge about coffee. To make it a little bit more fun, he brought samples of coffee with him today too. So help me give a warm welcome to Jake Maladra.
Happy to be here. I like spreading coffee knowledge. It is National Coffee Day, so how many of you have already drank coffee for the day? You guys are already ready to go. Cool. Just want to make sure, because I would switch up the order in which I do things, and we had to get coffee in us now first. I did bring some samples. I did bring some things. We're going to go through a coffee tasting, which we do fairly frequently at Starbucks. It's along the same lines as like a wine tasting, just with coffee. And so what I did is I compiled a lot of the things that I thought were not just the casual coffee knowledge. It's a little bit more in depth. So you guys can learn where your coffee comes from, because that's one of the things that not everybody knows. You know, you usually just pick up that pound of coffee from wherever, grind it up and drink it. You know, you don't think too much on where it was grown, how that influences the flavor of what you're getting, and all of those things. So starting off, coffee actually grows on trees. How many were aware of that? All right, we're starting off pretty hot here. It produces a fruit about this big. It's a coffee cherry. They are not very good to eat. We had an opportunity to try some of them at a Starbucks convention, and it was very bitter. But when you get that pit out, you get this green little bean, and that's what our coffee bean is. So then we take that green coffee bean, and we can do a bunch of things with it. Is anybody familiar with like the refreshers that Starbucks serves? Yeah. Very similar to like a juice beverage. It's very sweet, it's very fruity. Those are also made with green coffee, actually. So we take that green coffee bean and we smash it to get all of the juice, the extract out of it, and that's what provides the caffeine content in those refresher beverages. It provides a much lighter taste, it complements it real well with fruit, and you don't get that same like coffee flavor like you would from roasting. So, we got a couple different kinds of coffee trees. Depending on what region you are in the world, you might get different fruit from your trees. So, we have the Arabica coffee on the right side there. This one is much harder to care for. It takes much more water, much more care and attention. And then you have the Robusta. That one is much easier to grow. Again, you get the less refined flavors. So, when you find a packaging of premium coffee out there, 9 times out of 10 is going to have those Arabica beans in it. When you're getting kind of the lower shelf coffee, the middle tier, you're going to get mostly the Robusta because it fills in those beans. So you can still get some flavor with getting more beans that are easier to produce. So, you get different kinds of leaves on the trees too, just like with any fruit, you get different types of apples. That's like the best comparison I was able to find. When you go apple picking, you can get, the red delicious, you get the green Granny Smith, you get the yellow, and they all give you such different flavors as an end result. So what we do at Starbucks is we grow specific types of trees to get a specific end result of beans, which is really cool. You have the vertical, or varietal, which has the little clusters in the middle, and then you get the couture varietal, which has big clusters, and then the geisha varietal, which has a little bit more of a oval shape to them, and they're a little bit more spaced out on the actual plants. So, this right here is the coffee belt, and we'll do the whole globe in just a second here, but this is the ideal region for coffee growing. So most of the coffee that you drink is sourced from this kind of middle of the globe area. The conditions are perfect with the weather. The temperature is always fairly consistent. The humidity is a huge aspect of it. And that's what produces these great coffee cherries that have so much flavor in them. So we'll start with Latin America. Latin American coffees are usually brighter. They usually have more citrus notes to them. And so that's where, when we get to our blonde roast tasting, that's a Latin American coffee. It sits much lighter on your tongue than the dark or other growing regions would. And it's very, very bright, very upbeat. And then, as we move around, you get Africa. Africa has a bunch of coffee growing regions. So the coffees you get from kind of the coast, the Cape side, are very different than you're gonna get from the west side of Africa too, because of the soil content, because of what nutrients are in those soils. On the whole, African coffees can vary from very earthy. So when you think of earthy coffees, I don't want to use the term like burnt, but I would say like regular coffee. When you think of regular coffee, it's got those earthy aspects combined with some of the other fruity notes. So berries are high. African coffees have a lot of berry notes, have a lot of orange notes. The Latin America, when you think citrus, you're getting like lemon notes, you're getting brighter fruits rather than the orange and the berry. Asia Pacific coffees, I always describe these to people as very specific. So we have a coffee at Starbucks called the Komodo Dragon Roast, and it tastes spicy. It's got a lot of spice content to it. Things like notes of nutmeg, notes of cinnamon. Those are coming from coffees that are grown in that Asia Pacific region. That spice a lot of times comes from the volcanic nature of the soil out there. So all of these little islands that you see on the map have volcanoes. So they've had volcanic ash and all those things fall into their soil over the past hundreds of thousands of years. That, again, comes out with a very different end result than anywhere else in the world, which is really cool. So we take a lot of pride in our farms in these different regions. One of the things that's worth mentioning with Starbucks is sustainability. So coffee plants take a bunch of water. So how are we making sure that these farms aren't just sapping all the resources in any given region? And so we've been able to work with the regions that are out there that we put our coffee farms in to build more sustainable farms than in previous coffee history. A great comparison is like the almonds. So almonds, again, take a lot of water to grow. So as they start creating more and more almond farms, they have to find ways to get the water there and make them sustainable, so you're not pulling water from everywhere else just to grow coffee beans or almonds. All right, so then we talk about roasting. So after we got our green coffee bean, we take it and we put it into this big old hopper. And that's when they start the roasting process. So I do have samples here, so when we come up and start doing our coffee tasting, you can look. The blonde roast is very light, as you can see. That's the lightest roast that Starbucks provides. Blonde roast translates to light roast coffee. So they're usually not as heavy. That's where you get those, again, Latin American coffees, the brighter flavors. When you have a cup of the opposite end, the dark roast, it can come out very oily. It has that real thick, what we call a body. And that is because it's roasted much longer. The light roast is roasted real quick just to get kind of a base. Now, the one that's not up here is decaf. So decaf is the farthest down, even further roasted than dark roast, because it roasts all of those oils out of the beans. So the oil is where we get our caffeine content. That's where all of the caffeine comes from in your cup of coffee, is the amount of oil left on your bean. So in order to get decaf, you gotta roast it all out. And so up here, the one that's on my far left, your right, you'll be able to see that there's no oil on those beans because it's decaf.
So is espresso on the other end?
Espresso is the dark roast end of the spectrum. So we take our espresso and we roast it to the point where those oils are coming to the top of the bean. If we roasted it for another probably hour or 2 hours, that's when it ends as decaf, because then all those oils burn off in the roasting process. Any other questions? I can talk real fast, so always just stop me. What do you got?
This makes sense because I couldn't understand why a dark roast, which I like, had less caffeine in it than a light roast. So now with your explanation, I understand.
Yep. And so when you have the light roast, because it's so quick, it's such a brief roasting process, a lot of those oils stay in the bean. And so then when you're grinding it and brewing it, you get a lot more of those oils in your cup of coffee which provides the caffeine content. The darker roast, like she was saying, has less caffeine because all those oils have been brought to the surface of the bean. So a lot of times in the grinder or something like that, they sit to the actual like sides of the grinder. They come off a little bit easier than they would on a light roast coffee.
It seems like it has more caffeine.
Yep, it seems like it should because the taste is that much stronger. But in actuality, that taste is coming from how long it was roasted. So, what's up? Did you have a question?
Me?
Oh, behind you.
Oh,
No?
okay, but she kind of answered it.
Cool.
So with all those different roasts, the blonde is gonna have the most caffeine?
Yep, absolutely. Because the longer you roast it, the more comes out. That's just a good general rule of thumb to think of.
So if you're buying like a special coffee with a certain taste
Yep.
to it, you can't get that in decaffeinated?
Correct. So we only come out with, I can only speak to Starbucks personally, but we come out with such limited decaffeinated options because of how hard and how intensely you have to roast it. So when you have our
Cherry chocolate, I know you.
cherry chocolate coffee, or right now we're promoting one that's like lemon and chocolate flavored, the Cassie Cielo. Those beans have such a specific flavor that they're going for in the end result that they haven't been able to achieve it with decaf as well.
And the caffeine in espresso is,
So the difference between a shot of espresso and like what a regular cup of coffee would be comes from the amount of grounds and water that you're doing. So a shot of espresso comes out as just, 8 ounces, right? As opposed to your whole cup of coffee, which is anywhere from 12 to 20 ounces. You're using the same amount of beans in both. So you take all of those beans that you would take in a regular cup of coffee and we compact them real hard and then force water through it. And so that ends up with less water, obviously, as the shot of espresso, but it has the same amount of caffeine that's pulled out of the beans. So that's kind of the difference. We will start to talk about brew methods in just a minute, so that was a perfect transition there.
thank you.
So, yep, she's gonna start pouring coffees. We're gonna start talking a little bit about tasting coffees as well. So, has anybody done like an actual coffee tasting, or you just drink your coffee in the morning, you're like, that's real good? Yeah?
Yes, I am.
Cool. When you did it, did you compare and contrast? Or did you just try like one coffee and see?
No, I went into the city and went to a coffee roaster and they had like 5 or 10 different ones in a row.
Awesome. That's what I would recommend. So if you're gonna do a coffee tasting, the reason I brought 2 different kinds here is because it's always best to have a comparison. It's very hard to pick up notes of coffee or what you're tasting for with just one option. So when you have something to contrast it, you'll be able to hopefully pick up those notes much quicker. So that's perfect, because that's exactly what I was gonna recommend. Always try a couple just to see what you got. So, like we were talking about, the flavors, they come from where it was grown, the way the cherry was removed and dried, and then the way the bean was roasted. So there's so many levels of how we get a specific flavor at the end of the day, which is really cool. So, as you guys all start going in, we're gonna talk about the 4 fundamentals of a good cup of coffee. You gotta make sure your proportion is right. You don't wanna be putting more grounds than water, more water than grounds. You're not gonna get the end result that you're looking for. The grind. So he brought up espresso roast versus regular cup of coffee. Espresso is a very finely ground powder that we shoot the water through. When you're making coffee in your Mr. Coffee Maker or a pour over, it's much more coarse. The bean chunks are a lot bigger. Then water, obviously you want to use good water. If you're using water like well water or something along those lines, you're gonna get that taste in your coffee, just like with anything else you would make. And then keeping your coffee fresh. So one of the things that I always tell people, please don't put your coffee in the freezer. The cold from the freezer will dry out those beans, and a lot of the oils that the roasters work very hard to get in there will dry out with that cold temperature. So you don't want dry beans because it's not going to be a great cup of coffee. So keep them at room temperature if you can.
What is the proportion from grounds to water?
The proportion, so usually with a brewed cup of coffee, you're looking for 2 tablespoons for every 6 ounces of water that you want in there. Do you have a question as well? Oh, I couldn't tell if it was ahead or done. All right. So, thank you. the amount of coffee versus water. So 2 tablespoons for every 6 ounces. Too little coffee, you might end up with a bitter brew. Too much coffee, and you're gonna get a very sour, strong tasting cup of coffee. So, if you want a weaker cup of coffee, brew it first and then add hot water after the fact. Because that hot water is not passing through your beans, so you're not gonna mess up your ratio in the end result. So then we talk about the grind, and that's the size of the coffee particles that are in there. There is no universal grind size. You can use similar types for like a Mr. Coffee machine at home versus a paper filter. Those are the only two that are comparable though. French presses, big coffee maker with a plunger, that takes the most coarse ground because those beans are soaking in the water the whole time. Espresso is the opposite end of the spectrum. It's a very finely ground because you're forcing the water through there. You're not letting the beans sit in the water to brew it. So, you can see the very coarse, that's our French press there, and this fine and extra fine, that's where we're ending for espresso. So, the espresso machines that I imagine most of you are picturing, they shoot out a little puck of grounds when they're done because of how hard you pack the grounds in and how hard you're forcing that water through. So, if you have ground your coffee correctly, that puck is going to be solid. It's going to be an actual solid object. It's not just a bunch of grounds. That's how you know you have the right proportion. And then the last one, water. So, always, as best you can, try and use filtered water. Because there's so many sediment, fluoride, chemicals in water that we just don't really pick up, but that can alter the taste of that end cup of coffee. The way the oils interact with different chemicals in the water can provide you with a different end result. Now, is it something that you're gonna taste and be like, ooh, that was not good at all? Maybe not, but if you want a pure tasting cup of coffee, always try and use the purest water you can. The perfect temperature for brewing between 195 and 205. So again, you don't want it too hot, but if you're trying to brew coffee cold and make it a brewed cup of coffee with cold water, you're not gonna soak up any of the oils from the beans. So, 4 steps of a coffee tasting, and I saw most of you already got into your coffees, so I'm glad. But the first step that you're gonna wanna do is you smell it. Yeah, if you wanna start doing the blonde roast here, we'll compare and contrast. So you inhale deeply so that your mouth, the taste buds, kind of are prepared for what's about to happen. The next step is the best one. You give it a good loud slurp. So not like an actual sip, slurp it, because you're gonna see it splash across your tongue in different ways. With the medium roast, the Pike's Place, you should feel it land when you slurp, kind of on the middle of your tongue. It's a medium roast, that's where it's supposed to land. When we get to the blonde roast over here, you're gonna feel it hit on the tip and on the sides of your tongue. Because it's a lighter coffee, the taste buds for the brighter notes, the fruitier notes, are on the tip and sides of your tongue as opposed to right in the middle. Now, when you get to the darkest end of the spectrum, the real dark roasts, you'll feel them right in the middle. Those oils will kind of sit on your tongue for a little bit longer. And so that's how you'll be able to differentiate, like right off the bat, what roast of coffee you're tasting. So does anybody have, we're gonna start describing notes that they picked up in this first cup of coffee. Either from smelling or when they slurp it. One of the things to keep in mind with the coffee tasting, there's no wrong answers. Again, just like a wine tasting, we're drinking coffee and having fun, that's the point.
I taste the salty.
Okay. Anybody else tasting any different notes?
Maybe a little bit of chocolate.
There you go, that's good. I'm impressed. I spent probably my first year at Starbucks saying all coffees tasted hot, so if that's gonna put you guys at ease for what you're tasting. With the medium roast that we tasted, the chocolate notes are in both of them, but the medium roast had nuttier notes. So then when you get to the blonde roast, you're gonna get more of the chocolate. You might even be able to pick up some subtle fruit flavors in there. Anything else anybody tastes?
I almost said like woody.
Yep, a little bit like roasty almost, yep. All right. So, the these are just some examples of describing coffee, and again, you guys did a great job with describing it. So subtle notes of cocoa, toasted nuts. You get the earthy layered notes. That's a very specific coffee they're talking about. But you get the complex flavors. You get a full body blend. So the aroma is what we were smelling. Those different, you said the roasty, almost like a fire notes. There's no wrong answer. You might smell chocolate, but you might not taste it. You might smell the fruity notes of berry or whatever, but it might not taste the same to you. It's all perspective. And the more you do, the better you're gonna become at it. So then we talk about the acidity. And this is a big one that people don't really think about as much. So the blonde roast, like I was saying, the tip and the sides of your tongue, that's where the acidity taste buds are. That's when where you're gonna feel that blonde roast hit. The less acidic coffees, the darker roasts, those you feel on the center, because that's where the taste buds are for that. The thing to note with acidity, I don't have a whole slide for it, but brewing methods can also change the acidity of coffee. So how many of you drink iced coffee? Are there any iced coffee drinkers out there? All right, a good handful. What about cold brew as opposed to the iced coffee? Yeah, all right. So when we brew our iced coffee, we're brewing a hot cup of coffee that's then poured over ice. That results in a much higher acidity content because of the hot to cold. It's almost like a shock to the coffee. The difference between iced coffee and cold brew is brewed like almost like a tea. It's steeped overnight. So we take these beans, we let them sit in the water for 20 hours. That comes out with a much less acidic cup because it's never hot and then cold again. It's always either room temperature or cold. And so when you get the cold brew, it's gonna be very smooth. So one of the things I always recommend to people when they're like, I just can't get behind your iced coffee, it's very bitter. It's because it is bitter. You're right, it's brewed hot and then over ice. So try the cold brew because it's gonna be very smooth. You're not gonna get that same bite that you get from just black iced coffee.
What about Nitro cold brew?
So the Nitro cold brew, we actually take that same cold brew coffee that's already nice and smooth, and we infuse it with nitrogen gas. And that's what gives it that head of foam that it comes out with. It also makes it a much creamier beverage. And so for those of you that may want to try black coffee without having cream in it, the Nitro cold brew is like the perfect compromise because that nitrogen gas actually changes the consistency of the coffee without having to add half and half or milk or whatever it is to kind of lighten it up as you go. So then the final brew method, the espresso, like we've been talking about, we take that hot water and we blast it through some very compacted beans. And that is how you get just your little shot, but the amount of coffee grounds in there is the same as a regular cup of coffee. It's just how compact and how quickly that water is pressed through it that changes the whole taste of it.
Paper filters, wouldn't they, strain out the oils? Wouldn't you get less caffeine if you use a paper filter? Because
Yes, but it's not as drastic as you might think. Because they roast the coffee knowing that that's the most common brew method is the paper filter. The filters are also designed not to take out just the oils. So yes, there will be less, but it's not a drastic shift as opposed to like an espresso or a French press.
Thanks.
With the espresso, I know you talked about caffeine content a little bit earlier, but I always thought the espresso had more caffeine, but that isn't the case, right?
Not specifically, so that one's tricky to describe because yes, it's gonna have more caffeine in that little slurp, but the entire cup of hot coffee is gonna have more caffeine content because it's just a bigger beverage. So they brew, the espresso shots have about 60-ish milligrams of caffeine, whereas a grande cup of coffee is gonna have like 160-ish because of the amount of brew that's in it, the amount of time that comes out, because when you have just that little shot of espresso, it's just, if you were to fill up 16 ounces of espresso, you would have far more caffeine than you would ever need, so.
And you'd never sleep.
Exactly,
for like
you would
2
never
weeks.
sleep again. So that's kind of the difference and the trade-off of them. But most of our espresso beverages at Starbucks do come with 2 to 3 shots, so they do equate to about the same as that size of a hot cup of coffee.
Thank you.
The body is what we talk about when you look at coffee or an espresso shot. It's the middle of it. It should be nice and dark. It should be, you should have a nice, like, almost head of foam on the top. That's where a lot of the oils will rise to. But a lot of your flavor is gonna come out of this body of coffee. So like whole milk, that full-bodied cup of coffee is very thick compared to your skim milk, which is very runny, very watery. So then we're gonna talk about a little bit of espresso. So single shot or solo shot is just 1. We have the doppio or a double shot, which is 2. The triple or the quad are 3. Solo and doppio are only used when referring to shots of espresso on their own. So you're not doing a doppio latte, you're doing a 2-shot latte. If you want a doppio, it's just espresso. So that one I would always recommend be careful with, because if you end up with just espresso, you might have a very different day than you originally planned. So we have some of our espresso beverages as well, because that's what we're all familiar with at coffee shops and stuff like that. It's not just the hot coffees that we serve, but what other sort of beverages. So we have just our shot of espresso. That's what a good handful of people show up just for those. I do have customers that come back just for their shot or their 2 shots of espresso every day, and that's all they want. Then we talk about the Americano. This is a good way to space out those espresso shots to make them very similar to a cup of coffee. So you get your hot espresso shots, we then pour hot water on the top of it to mix it out. It kind of thins out the espresso just a little bit, and it makes it much more drinkable like a cup of coffee, rather than just those quick shots of espresso. Then we move on to our latte. So a latte's got that same shots of espresso in the bottom, and then you get mostly steamed milk with just a thin little layer of foam on the top. That stands in contrast with this cappuccino, because the cappuccino is mostly foam on top of those espresso shots. So a good cappuccino should come out weighing almost nothing, because it's just espresso shots and milk foam. The latte is gonna have much more liquid to it because of the steamed milk with just a little bit of foam on the top. So I don't know if it's hard to see out there, but the cappuccino has these 3 different colors here. That shows you how much foam you're gonna get in your beverage. The latte just has this very light head of foam on it. The cappuccino is over half foam. You'll get different flavors out of it as well. So the milk foam itself comes out with a sweeter flavor than just the entire steamed milk. The latte, you're gonna get a very milky flavor. The steamed milk doesn't change as much, but when you start to foam it up, which we call aerating, adding the bubbles, you start to get a sweeter flavor out of whatever milk you're using, which is really cool. So that is my presentation for you guys. What sort of questions do you have? I'm just gonna open it up at the end here.
Pea berry beans. You haven't mentioned them. It's a smaller bean, right?
Yes,
You
that's
start
all I
off-
know about them though. I don't, yeah.
You see them at, not very commonly. I was wondering if they're, have more flavor, more caffeine, more.
So what I know about them is they come from one of the more specific types of coffee tree, and that's why they're smaller. So they end up getting, I won't say more or less flavor, but a different. They get those pea berry beans for a specific end result of flavor, rather than the roasting process being what brings out the flavor.
I imagine they're a bigger pain in the neck to harvest.
Yep, exactly. And they're, a lot of times those might be what we call sun-dried. So when you get a green coffee bean, something, just another quick fun fact, there's a couple ways to process it before you start roasting it. You can either wash it to get kind of all the fruit bits off of it, or you can leave it out to dry in the sun. And so the sun-dried beans, they usually don't roast because they roast from the sunlight as well. So you get a much different flavor at the end of them. And a lot of times they do use those Peabody, those smaller beans, because of, it's much harder to lay out the big beans in the sun. You need much more space. Does that make sense?
Can you explain a little about the different kinds of milk when they're steaming it? Oat, almond, oat?
Yes. So milk alternatives are a huge thing now, which is very cool. but it will change the profile of your drink. So almond milk, for example, has more of those nutty notes. You're gonna get a much more earthy beverage than something like soy milk, which we use like a vanilla soy milk. That's gonna give you a very sweet, different type of beverage. With alternative milks, what I found as well is it's much harder to get the foam out of them. They don't hold foam very well. They wanna make lattes very easily, but to make a cappuccino out of a non-dairy milk, it's very, very tough. So with regular dairy milks, the interesting thing is the lighter milks, so non-fat 2%, make foam much better than the heavier milks. The heavier milks, it is very hard to get good foam with because of how dense of a liquid it is. And that's when you start to notice the sweeter milks coming into play. So non-fat milk doesn't have a whole lot of flavor to it just in general if you were to drink a cold cup of milk. But when you aerate it, you'll start to see the sweetness come out. So it changes almost the chemical makeup of the milk as we're steaming it to get a little bit of a sweeter beverage.
If I say a skinny cappuccino, like I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Is it non-fat milk? or-
It'll be non-fat milk, yep. And so that you'll get a very, very light to the touch beverage or light to hold because of how much foam is in there. And non-fat milk is the lightest of the dairy milks just right out of the gates. When we foam that one up, it gets even lighter. A lot of times that's a beverage that you would almost have to use like a spoon to get most of it out of because of how foamy it gets. And so it takes time to enjoy it, which is really cool.
Actually, Weight Watchers says that's the best choice.
Yep. It's because of you'll get kind of the feeling of drinking a full beverage without as much actual liquid in there. You need less milk, but since it's more foam, it kind of equates to a much healthier beverage, because you're not drinking as much milk.
Do you guys foam chocolate milk too?
We can. We don't have a beverage that's foamed with chocolate, so usually our syrups we put in with the espresso at the bottom. And the reason for that is Starbucks designed all of its syrups in this lab to chemically bond with our espresso. So it changes the flavor of both the espresso and the entire beverage when you put those syrups in the bottom, and the heat of the hot espresso mixes with that syrup, and then it foams all the way up through the whole beverage. Now that's not to say you couldn't put the chocolate in the milk, but the reason that we put it in the espresso shots is because of that chemical makeup again. So I actually thought that was very interesting too. So even we have like syrups and sauces. So pumpkin spice is a sauce, it's very thick. We have like vanilla syrup, which is clear, it's like much thinner. Both are made to chemically bond with the espresso and change the flavor of that espresso, which is really cool.
Many years ago, I got some Starbucks Indonesian coffee. It was a special, one of a kind. It had molded in transport. They said it got moldy on the boat, and it was a unique flavor. Was that an accident?
Yes, I would imagine so. So depending on how many years ago, I do know that they have rolled out this technology with how they transport their beans. So it's like this little circle we call flavor lock. And what it does is you're able to push out all of the air and moisture from the bag with keeping the coffee fresh. And so it won't let air or moisture back in, but it will let it out, which is really cool. And I wonder if that was a direct result of maybe bean transportation issues.
It's different.
Yeah, I would imagine so, but yeah. The goal is to keep your beans like in transit as dry and in as neutral of a temperature location as well as without humidity as we can. So, yeah. Other questions? Anything you guys are curious about?
Every 5 or 10 years, you hear this big scare that there's no coffee crop this year. There was a freeze, or there was a drought, or whatever, and then the prices go up a little bit. But still, I've never seen it where coffee was unavailable.
Yep. So one of the things that Starbucks does very well and other companies are following suit of is we diversify where our farms are. So there was, I wanna say it was last year or the year before, where a drought hit our Latin American farms. And so we did not get our Latin American coffees like we thought we would, but they were able to kind of fill in that gap with more Latin American coffees. So they have farms at different, with the coffee belt going the span of the entire globe. If one region in Latin America is hit with a drought or whatever it may be, those Asian Pacific regions might be just fine, or they might be producing more. So it's cool to see them be able to balance it without losing an entire crop. Does that make sense? Yeah.
What is your favorite cup of coffee and why?
My favorite cup of coffee, I actually would say the Pike's Place roast now. I used to be a light roast person. I used to think Starbucks coffees taste a little bit burnt, in my opinion. So when people say that, I'm not offended, don't worry. But the Pike's Place has really grown because of how versatile it is, because you can drink it at any time of day. The other is I like plain, just cold brew coffee. I like the low acidity content, and because it's brewed overnight, it ends up having a little bit more caffeine content than a regular hot cup of coffee would as well. So that's usually my other go-to, is depending on the weather outside, I either pick the hot or the cold brew. Yeah.
Do you have any comments on nutrition or health benefits or dangers of canned coffee?
If you're looking for something that's not unhealthy for you, black coffee is the way to go. Steer clear from the flavors, because that's where you're gonna start getting a lot of the calories. You also, in the milk-based beverages, that's where a lot of the calories are gonna come from as well. So what kind of milk are you using, how much of it? Because if you get a regular cup of just hot coffee, it's just beans and water. There's nothing else put in it unless you put something in it yourself. Once you get into the lattes, that's when the milk's introduced, and that can change. If it's a whole milk beverage and you're drinking, 20 ounces of whole milk every day, that's a lot of calories. So just be mindful of that, is the best advice I can give people. Please help yourself to more coffee. We're gonna leave it with the library here too. I brought plenty, just in case you guys wanted a lunch, so. I would rather be over-prepared than under-prepared as far as bringing in enough coffee for everyone, so.
Thank you, Jay.
Yeah, thank you guys very much.